Thanks everybody for joining us. I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Federico Fancellu, and he's a senior research scientist at Samsung AI in Toronto. His talk today is going to be titled "The Messy Yet Exciting World of Semantic Parsing." A brief bio about Dr. Federico. He's a senior research scientist in NLP at Samsung AI. After many years spent studying linguistics, he completed his PhD and postdoc at the School of Informatics, University of Edinburgh, where his research focused on how to extract and represent complex aspects of meaning, e.g. negation, from natural language. During his PhD, Federico also got interested in open domain conversational AI while leading the University of Edinburgh team in the first Amazon Alexa challenge. Wow, that's awesome. So his talk today, Semantic Parsing, he will be giving us an overview on the current state of the art of semantic parsing and the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead. His hope is to show us that semantic parsing can be messy, but also fascinating and exciting at the same time. So without much ado, Federico, I hand the stage over to you.
All right. Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for having me. Yeah, I'm Federico Fancellu, and I'm a senior researcher at Samsung AI here in Toronto. And today's talk is going to be a bit on high-level overview on what I call the messy yet exciting world of semantic parsing, and kind of what I want kind of to convey today is actually try to give you an high-level overview of what is semantic parsing. So I'm going to start with some definitions and some discussion about the data that we use and we manipulate. And then I'm going to go through the techniques that we use to do semantic parsing. And then, so I spent pretty much most of my career in research. So I also want to kind of give you an overview and my personal opinions as well on where I think semantic parsing is heading towards and what is the current state of research in semantic parsing. So what we're interested in, and I think what kind of people should get on board and work on. What I hope that kind of I can convey through this talk is actually semantic parsing can be a very messy and also quite an intimidating field when you first approach it, but then once you get into it and you actually tackle one of the most fundamental problems of artificial intelligence, which is the quest for meaning, of understanding meaning, it becomes very exciting and a very kind of enticing world to be involved in. So without further ado, so let me start with some formalities. So let me start with kind of a definition of semantic parsing. So when people ask me to give kind of a very quick definition of semantic parsing, I always try to keep it to the bare minimum and to keep it as vague as possible. So what I define as semantic parsing is nothing but the task of understanding a natural language input. So the reason why I always keep it very vague is because understanding a natural language input really depends on the input that you have in front of it. We'll see also later that defining understanding, it's almost impossible, in my opinion. So, but going back kind of to the type of natural language inputs that define understanding, as I see, semantic parsing can be really kind of divided into two subfields. So there's one set of studies and one thread of research that looks at interpreting instructions or somehow turning natural language statements into machine-readable instructions. So if I'm at home and I want to tell, I don't know, my Internet of Things, and I want to somehow operate a certain device with my voice, I can say something. The machine, of course, needs to interpret what I say, and so semantic parsing comes into action and turns what I say into an executable, meaning a machine-readable and executable tree or graph that then the device can understand and act upon. So However, there's also another side of semantic parsing as I see it, which is instead concerned with extracting meaning representations from text. So what that means is that how do we actually take one sentence and then extract what the sentence says? What is that? What's the meaning of the sentence itself? So how do we go and represent actually the meaning, which is kind of the subfield of semantic parsing that I'm mostly interested in. So it turns out that you can represent meaning as a graph. So there's nothing really more to it. And this graph is usually composed by the entities that are mentioned in a sentence. And by entities, I mean events, entities, qualities of these entities. For instance, in this particular sentence, Anna met her sister yesterday. There's an event, which is to meet. And then you can see that we can extract the fact that there's a person, there's a name, Anna, there's a sister that is mentioned, and there's a time reference like yesterday. But then these entities somehow needs to be connected with each other. And that's where these directed edges come into play, where we actually want to kind of connect these entities so that we extrapolate the meaning of the sentence. And then we are able to answer these simple questions like, who does the meeting? Whose sister is this? When does the meeting happen? What's the name of the person? So as you can see, okay, so you can represent meaning as a graph. And that would be good if that's everything. So we would probably already solve semantic parsing. There's also although there's one aspect that makes, in my opinion, semantic parsing a big mess. The problem is that everything that we do in NLP, or at least almost everything that we do in NLP, comes from actually a long-standing tradition of studies in linguistics. So most of the things that we do, and in this case, for instance, extract and represent meaning, comes actually from studies long-standing studies in linguistics. And if you ever worked in linguistics, or if you're a linguist yourself, one thing that you should know about linguistics is that nobody agrees with each other. And of course, nobody actually ever agreed on how to represent meaning. So different theories have their own ways of representing meaning. And what happens is that because of that reflects in NLP, and what we end up having nowadays is just like a plethora of different ways of representing meaning, which on the surface, yes, they all look like graphs. But the problem is that the inventory of labels and the way that certain aspects of meaning are represented or not represented are different from each other. So here on the screen, you have 4 of the main ones that we actually use in NLP nowadays, but these are just like a subset of a larger inventory. So that's why I started this talk telling you that semantic parsing is a bit of a mess, because there's a lot going on, and sometimes it's really hard to make order of what's going on. So of course, the question that then is most natural is, okay, so there's so many of these frameworks, there's so many data sets and theory that I can use to represent meaning, so which one should I go for? So I try to actually think about that myself, and here you have 4 of the main, that I put on the previous screen, that are the ones that are used the most to represent meaning. And then I try to come up with certain criteria that you should think about when you want to look at data sets to then train your semantic parser to extract meaning. Of course, the first of these criterion is data availability, because semantic parsing is mostly, I would say, for 99%, supervised machine learning tasks. So you need this data. And as you can see, you have actually data available for each of these framework. Although there's data available which has been manually annotated, people have also thought, okay, we always need more data. So can we actually then also generate more data than what's available that might not be manually annotated, but it's still more data that we can use to train our parser? And it turns out that there is some study done on data augmentation for semantic parsing to extract meaning, where you add automatically generated graphs during training. But in my opinion, I found the results a bit inconclusive, in a sense that sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't make a difference. So my tip is just you have to try it yourself. So your case might be different from previous work. So you shouldn't base your decision in the case of data augmentation on previous work. The second criterion that I was thinking about is actually whether you want to do deep natural language understanding or not, because using certain data sets actually allow you to do that, while others are not equipped with the annotation that will allow you to do that. And by deep natural language understanding, I mean something like if you want to do deep reasoning, if you're familiar with phenomena like presupposition, for instance, certain data sets allow you to do that, while others do not. One thing that is, I think, in my opinion, is sometimes a bit underestimated is also how well these data sets are maintained throughout time. Because sometimes you want to build a system that will last for quite a long period of time, that you want to somehow improve with time. And of course, you want to rely on a data sets that evolve organically and people are interested in and working on and refine. And here's where you kind of see a bit of differences, in a sense that there is one that, in my opinion, is dominating the NLP field, which is the abstract meaning representation framework. And it's dominating the NLP field because it's a very well DARPA-funded project. So there's a lot of money thrown into it. There's a lot of research groups working on it, and it's well-maintained, and there's a lot of interest. And relatively other frameworks are still well maintained, of course, but you have to consider that they are done by small academic groups, so the progress might not be as fast as abstract meaning representation in this case. A fourth criterion, which I'm going to bring up later in the talk, is actually also multilinguality. So, okay, so you want to extract meaning for English, and that's good for you, but English is just the tip of the iceberg and a drop in the ocean of all the languages that, of course, we speak on this planet. So although there exists kind of annotated data for other languages, I want to put a huge disclaimer that that doesn't mean that we have solved multilinguality, and I think we haven't even scratched the surface of multilinguality. You have data annotated for English and a bunch of European languages and then Chinese, but that's nothing compared to the inventory of the languages that we have to deal on in a daily basis. And finally, another thing that you should be concerned about if you want to decide for a framework or a data set over another is also whether whether you want to actually go and annotate data yourself, or you want to understand the data yourself, because some of these data sets, especially the ones that actually allow to do more deep natural language understanding, might be less friendly, and probably to understand and annotate might require actually some training in linguistics, or more specifically in formal semantics. So this is pretty much a summary of kind of the data problem in semantic parsing. And now, of course, let's move on to the techniques that we use to do semantic parsing. So semantic parsing, as I was saying, is mostly a supervised machine learning task. And the input is a sentence, and there's a model in between, and then what you want to get out of it is actually a graph. You're probably familiar with a lot of NLP tasks that use some encoder-decoder models. So you have your input that is encoded, and you can use an RNN or a transformer, which are usually the two that, or a variation of those, to then being able to decode into a sentence. And if you're familiar with machine translation, this is the kind of techniques that we also use in semantic parsing, where you have these inputs and you encode it, and then there's this model in between that decodes into something. Okay, the only problem though is that for semantic parsing, we don't deal with strings, but we deal in reconstructing a graph. And it turns out that the transducing into a graph is, especially in NLP, where you have to ensure that the final graph that you obtain actually does make sense. It's still a bit of an open research area, and we're still trying to figure out how to do that and how to ensure that the graph at the end makes sense and how to do that in an efficient way. But But kind of, you can also find that people are instead trying to avoid the problem altogether. And that's kind of the first techniques that I'm going to talk about, in a sense that you can also try to output the graph not as a graph itself, but as a string. And of course, by actually transforming the graph as a string, you kind of avoid the problem of generating a graph altogether, and you bring this system back to something that is very similar to a string-to-string task, like it would be machine translation. So the question is, okay, so how do you actually then turn the graph into a string? Turns out that actually it's not that very complicated to do that. So what you do is that you have your original graph, and what you do is that you traverse it using a certain traversal. People have used that first, usually and they found that actually works way better than other kind of traversal. And what you do is actually you start from a root node, and so from the root node you use it as you kind of give it an identifier, and then you use it a node label, and then you put a node label, and then you start traversing the graph down, so that first. And what you do is you start concatenating this identifier, node label, then edge label, and then you go to the next node, and you pretty much continue doing this recursively until you hit, of course, a leaf node, and at that point you close the parentheses. So the goal here is pretty much to represent the graph as a bracketed representation. Of course, the graph might contain nodes that refer back to something that you already generated. So at that point, that's where you use the unique identifier as a back pointer to refer back to something that you have already created. So in this case, when you get to sister, this then will refer back to person. And so you use this back pointer to refer back to it. And pretty much then you continue this way until you traverse the entire graph and you get out this string. So good, you have translated this graph into a string. And so what you can do now is actually do semantic parsing, going from a natural language sentence, which is a string, into a linearized graph, into linearized graph, which is also a string. And here you just pretty much treat the string as if it was like a sequential, pretty much a sequence of tokens and characters that you decode autoregressively. There's plenty of parsers that actually use these techniques. And a variation on these kind of generation of a linearized graphs is that instead of having nodes and edges predicted as a string, you first predict the nodes in a sequence using still the traversal techniques, and then you decide the connection between these different nodes, so the edges, through a technique that is very similar to one that is used in dependency parsing, which is called bi-affine parsing, that pretty much score every possible connection between a pair of words. Fine, so this is good. It seems like you actually are able to leverage very well understood techniques like RNN transformer to go from string to a linearized graph. But where's the problem? The problem lies here. So if you transform a graph into a string, what happens is that you don't have a graph anymore. So you treat pretty much a string as a sequence of characters or tokens that have no meaning whatsoever, or like they do not connect well to the original graph structure. And what that means is that you might end up generating at decoding time a graph that doesn't have, that might be complete rubbish. And that's, for instance, in this case. So if you happen to actually somehow generate in an incorrect way one of the back pointer, you might end up generating a meaning representation that corresponds to and can be read as Anna met the meeting sister yesterday, which doesn't make absolute sense. So what a lot of people do then to deal with these type of errors is that they have this very heavy post-processing on top of the generated strings. And this post-processing is usually tailored to a specific formalism or to the type of errors that they see in a specific data set, which is, of course, something that is not really ideal or is not really robust. And of course, other type of errors that you can incur into when you generate a string is that you might end up putting a lot of parentheses, and of course that would generate something that it's either a partial graph or something that is complete, again, rubbish. Fine, so So in order to make sure that, in order to kind of avoid these kind of problems where you might end up generating a graph that it's not valid and then you have to rely on post-processing, there's kind of a recent thread in research in semantic parsing that instead wants to treat the graph as such. So we are looking at ways that we can actually reconstruct and predict the graph as a graph so that we don't have to transform it into a string. That's where kind of I've done a bit of research alongside with other people. And these pretty much is based on what we call a graph grammars, which is pretty much nothing but taking kind of subgraphs and then try to piece them together and try to find the best combination of these subgraphs that would yield you a final graph that is the original graph. And of course, the challenge in doing this is make sure that actually these graphs combine well together. And so they will then end up generating something that is well formed and does not end up kind of generating a graph that doesn't make sense. I won't go too much into detail because it's quite an involved process of doing that, but I have some references and pointers at the end. Fine, okay, so let's talk about performance because that's kind of what we care about. So first of all, you see the first, so I put you kind of the comparison between kind of the state of the art for two different frameworks. One, they use these linearized graphs as string, and one, they use graph grammars. So you can see from performance alone that, of course, the linearized graph actually works very well and way better than actually using graph grammar. Again, so what I want you to kind of focus on is that linearized graph, again, use kind of a very, very involved post-processing kind of scripts that are very hard to kind of get into, very hard to modify, and that are very tailored to the frameworks and the data sets. So there's that disclaimer. So there is a risk of ill-formed graphs, and that's why heavy post-processing is put into place. Graph grammars do still underperform compared to linearized graphs, but are robust to actually, and they always end up generating well-formed graphs. But again, this is, as you can see also from the dates, is a very new area of research. So I'm very hopeful for the future in that particular direction. All right, so I want to conclude kind of the discussion on the techniques talking about multilingual semantic parsing. So far I've mentioned that, okay, so you have everything at your disposal to perform semantic parsing for English, but what happens if that I actually want to do it in another language, but I don't have much annotated data to train my semantic parser? So, and that's a huge problem, because really what I wanted to do is that being able to train the system in English and then test it in another language, which in this case I put it in Italian. Turns out that semantic parsing actually helps you already with that, because the meaning representation that you want to generate seem to be fairly robust, even with language differences, or at least when the languages are pretty similar to each other. And you can see in the case of English to the left and Italian to the right, the meaning representation is pretty much the same, except for the lexical elements that are different across languages. And so an active area of research right now in semantic parsing is to do what we call zero-shot cross-lingual semantic parsing. And what this means is that at training time, we only have one language available, usually the high resource one, which is English. And what we do is that in between, we have a model that is language independent, fairly language independent. So in this case, a multilingual transformer, so that at test time, we are able to pass a language that was not seen during training to then perform the zero-shot cross-lingual semantic parsing. Turns out that that's not just it, but what we recently have found is actually that we can actually improve on the performance of just having a multilingual transformers. And we actually experimented with a bunch of language independent features to do that. And it turns out that you can extract automatically and quite robustly a bunch of language independent features, such as universal part-to-speech tags or universal dependencies that you can add during training in a certain language. And then you also have access to them because you can extract them automatically during testing. So you can also add them during testing. and then use it jointly with your multilingual transformer. So I'm just going to present you kind of some results that these are published in the upcoming EMNLP 2021. But what I want to show you is that we did some zero-shot cross-lingual semantic parsing training in English and then testing it in German, Italian, and Dutch. And what we find, first of all, is sometimes transformer might not always be the best architecture to do what you want to do. So always be careful, because transformers are, of course, amazing, and 90% of the time they are the choice to perform your task. But it's always good also to look at other methods that might work better for certain tasks. But related kind of to the usefulness of these language-independent features, we also found that they consistently improve any kind of parser type of architecture that we tried for zero-shot cross-lingual semantic parsing. So indeed, language-independent features are very easy to extract, but they are robust, and they do improve the performance of your parser. And I'm done. So what I kind of talked about a bit are three main things. So to do semantic parsing, there is a lot of annotated data, but you need to know what you want to get out of it. There's a lot of technique, but again, you should know what you want to get out of it, because there's a bit of trade-off between performance, and if you care about that, you should go with linearized graphs. But if you care about robustness, then probably you should try something that treats graphs as such. And I also show you that I talk a bit about the fact that you can also build these multilingual semantic parsers just relying on one input language and testing on another. But again, I want to go back to the big disclaimer that I brought up when I was talking about multilinguality, because the zero-shot cross-lingual semantic parsing has only been tested on a small group of languages. And actually, I want to talk about these and the things we should care about moving on when it comes to semantic parsing. So where is there we are going? So unfortunately, and that's something that I really care about, NLP is a very English-centric field. And we all know that there is a plethora of other languages that hasn't even been touched, that are still called the low resource or no resource languages, that we really don't know how to actually process meaning for. So one aspect actually that moving forward, I think we should all care about is multilinguality. So the problem is that it's not only about building systems that are able to represent meanings in other language, but as a researcher, I also feel that we really don't know how to represent meaning, so not even annotate data, for languages that are very different from English. And I'm not even talking about indigenous languages, no resource language. I'm also talking about languages with a completely different structure than English, like for instance, Korean. And these zero-shot cross-lingual parsers that we are now beginning to build, we also don't know how robust they are or how well they perform. And actually, forget about multilinguality. Robustness is still a huge problem when it comes to these parsers, because it's still kind of, I don't have a clear idea how actually this semantic parser is actually robust beyond the usual corpora that we train and test on. And of course, this can be a huge problem, especially if you want to deploy them for production. And there is this beautiful paper, which it's called Climbing Towards NLU on Form, Meaning and Understanding, which it's definitely a suggested reading, because what I feel is that we're starting just now to actually care about what we mean by saying we extract the meaning of something, because understanding something, it's still something that I feel the community has somehow still yet to define. So there's also that on the aspect of robustness of this system. Let me see. Oh, what happened? Okay, so, and the last thing is that there's also work that has been done on actually of using semantic parsing for specific application, and both building this application and also annotating data that fits certain applications. So if you're interested in navigation or dialogue or annotation of law documents and understanding of law documents, people have actually looked into it. So kind of to extend and to use meaning representation for specific downstream applications. If I have a bunch of references for everything that I've said, so feel free to bug me if you're interested. And thank you very much. This is my Twitter handle. I'm not really a social media person, but feel free to message me if you want. And I'm done.
Thank you so much, Federico. That was a very interesting discussion, for sure. Questions from the audience? I think there is a question here. Red Chani is asking for a link to the paper. I think the second to the last slide you talked about a paper, and I think that's probably the paper, that I would really appreciate if you sent him the link. So
if you send me a private message, then I'll send you directly.
Okay.
There.
Awesome. Any more questions? I do have one question that I'd like to ask. Actually, NLU is something of an interest to me also. But then when you talked about linearized graphs and they outperforming the graphs, basically the graph-based model that you have, one question I had was, couldn't the training of the linearized graphs be conditioned on them actually creating these wall-form graphs, as well as also conditioned on them forming well-trained sentences, rather than them having this post, you said they had this very huge post-processing that they had to do on the output from the linearized graphs?
It's a bit tricky in a sense that, I mean, it deserves a bit of thinking. In a sense, it depends what elements you want to preserve and kind of what elements you want to make sure, what part of the structure you want to actually make sure that you preserve at a certain moment during the coding. So I'm not sure how you represent this conditioning part, so I did a bit of work in the past in actually marrying the two, so kind of marrying the linearize the coding so that you kind of do it sequentially, so condition on what you have done so far, but instead of outputting token, you output subgraphs, and kind of the sequence of subgraphs that you decode then actually make sure that you reconstruct the full form graph. So, but kind of forget about subgraphs. Doing that at a string level, it's a bit more complex, I think. Especially with transformer, I think that they don't decode just in words, but they decode in subtokens. I think there's a bit of a more involved kind of processing to do.
Makes sense. Yeah, thank you. It's a great answer, sure. I do not see any more questions. But I mean, very great presentation. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. And thanks to the audience for coming, for sure. Yep. Thank you.
Thank you.